confirm that that works, and I will let you know. We are live. Go ahead.
All right. Well, thank everybody for coming back here. We'll go ahead and call our meeting to order officially. So we'll go ahead and start with our roll call. So from the 1st Congressional District, Commissioner Tobias.
Present.
Commissioner Anthony from the 2nd Congressional District.
Present.
Okay. Commissioner McClellan from the 3rd Congressional District.
Present.
Commissioner Rangel from the 4th Congressional District.
Present.
Okay. Commissioner Ram from the 5th.
Present.
And Commissioner Prentice, I don't see her on right now, but we'll
I'm here.
Oh, there, I hear you. Oh, there you go. Sorry. I have it on this gallery view, so sorry about that. Commissioner Bissonette from the 7th.
Present.
Okay. And Commissioner Phillips from the 8th.
Present.
All right, guys. Well, again, thank everyone for coming out here. I'm pulling up our revised agenda now. So essentially what we wanted to do, the bulk of our meeting today would be to sort of get into what our line drawer committees have really been doing throughout the last couple of weeks in terms of creating our criterion and coming to consensus. But before we did that, of course, we wanted to go over any comments or any questions regarding our most recent hearing that we had, which I thought was very informative from both of our expert speakers as well as our public testimony. It was really plus as we were discussing before we went live here. And so, just to kind of start with our presenters, does anyone have any specific questions or comments or anything with regards to that hearing? Yep, go for it, Tony. Oh, no. Okay. All right. Anything in particular regarding the public testimony? I don't know if you guys saw the promo video that was sent out by Molly. It was really a powerful testimony that we got from Aubrey, who was one of the public testimony providers. But anything in particular, any questions or any concerns or comments about any of the public testimony provided?
Sorry, I actually had something for the expert testimony. There was at one point, I think there was a question asked around like, what should we expect in terms of how the legislature might respond? And the former representative had mentioned the worst case scenario being like the legislature passes a resolution that circumvents the governor's and they like pass maps without the role. Like, I guess, can anyone comment on maybe this is more of a question for Jack or Maddie? Like, what is that? Oh, like, is that possible? Like, can they actually do that? I didn't think that would be like constitutionally appropriate or legal.
Well, I can maybe field that in a very brief way and then explain how you'll get a fuller answer. It is inconsistent with past practice in this and most, if not every other state. I believe it's unconstitutional. I'm a lawyer, but I'm not an expert by any means in that clause of the Constitution. We are having a meeting March 11th, our final public testimony meeting, and I've talked to Chair Ford some about this. The plan for that meeting is to have the theme be the legal sort of roadmap of redistricting. And I think we're going to have some kind of cool national level, some local, some national guests to talk about that. And in fact, there's a group at Princeton that presented to this committee or to the commission already about who does something similar to what Moon's group does. I think you guys probably remember them. And they were in contact with us about this very issue. They've well researched it. So I was hoping to get one of them to at least give a short primer on that. The short answer is that it's unlikely, but that the state Supreme Court decides what's constitutional under the Constitution here in Wisconsin. So I'm not on it, and I can't give any opinion beyond that, really. But smarter people than me will be here to talk to you on March 11th about that.
Great, thank you.
It's it was discussed prior. So a lot of the news that came out recently was the pushback for the census data until September. And so in talking to Jack, as discussed, that's one of the things that we thought would be a good primer, is for us as well as to anyone who is watching from the public aspect of it too, just to have an update as to what we're going to be considering, what the new timeline is. And another thing we kind of discussed just in brief was potentially, having more meetings, more hearings outside of what we have scheduled right now, because before the pandemic, all this was kind of, not in our foresight, being, we would be outside of what has normally been done for years and years and years because of the pandemic and because of the census. So it's just something that we're considering and something to consider as we go forward with the process.
Yeah, I would just say that, what Chair Ford says is correct, that I had spoken to him about essentially the next few months. The census data being delayed, I think is, I apologize. The census data being delayed, I think, is pretty unequivocally not a great thing. But the silver lining to that cloud is that it gives the commission a little more time to do, what it, whatever it wants to do, really. And so one thing that Chair Ford and I had talked about is reaching out to some people from the census to describe that timeline if they can. No promises there. But any of you who have any ideas on stuff like that can contact me via phone or email, and we can kind of talk about it. I think there's some more input out there that we could solicit. So that you could solicit, but that's going to be a little bit more up in the air for now. So anyway, thank you. I'll stop taking up everyone's time.
Oh, no. Okay. Any other questions or any thoughts on the previous hearing that we had? If not, I believe we can go into our next topic, which is kind of going over the one of our representatives from the DOA will be here to kind of discuss some of our funding available as well.
I had a question for Jack, if that's okay. And it was surrounding the news that came out the other day about the attorneys being hired or retained from the legislature. And it mentioned that the governor had not yet done that. Can you describe that to us?
I can describe just a little bit. I mean, and we'll hear a little bit more about the reasons for this in that March 11th hearing, but it's pretty unlikely that the governor himself is going to be a party to redistricting litigation. And now I can't predict the Supreme Court's rule change. That could change things because they have the power to hear what the kind of cases they want to hear, and they might come out with a different rule. And Chair Ford testified on behalf of the People's Maps Commission there. The legislature retained those lawyers, I think, I can't speak for them completely, but to in anticipation of the census data being done earlier, and it's not. So they've got those attorneys lined up and ready, seemingly to draw the maps in a similar fashion to 2011. But I don't know, because they're the only ones that know. The public portions of that are the contracts and the amount of money they pay. The governor's office, if involved in litigation, will very, very likely use the Attorney General's office as their attorneys, like in any other case. But I don't foresee that becoming the case, because really it's a citizen's job, or interest groups or something like that. And again, you'll hear more about this on the March 11th hearing, but to force the state to do its job and put new maps forward. As far as somebody, now the governor in this case is distinct from the People's Maps Commission, and how the People's Maps Commission's interests will be protected, or rather their work will be advocated for, will likely not be in a legal setting in a formal way, not as a party to a lawsuit, but instead something that the parties use, like whether it's, I don't even really want to speculate because I don't know, but whether it's the ACLU, NAACP, Law Forward, which is a new advocacy group, but something like that brings the suit to force the state to draw up maps, because while it's unclear what exactly will come out of the legislature, it could be very fair and the governor could sign it and we could all move on. I think it's reasonable to expect that that might not be the case, and that therefore there will be in some impasse and litigation will occur. And listen, I'll be 100% frank, is that, there aren't a lot of people that know exactly how that's going to play out, because this is such an infrequent activity of the state. Every 10 years, the last one, there was very minimal litigation over a few lines, but not over drawing the whole set of maps, a whole array of them. So the last time that happened was in 2001. And that's part of the reason for the March 11th theme, is just to give us all some idea of like, well, okay, let's say that a somewhat likely scenario, the legislature passes maps that the governor doesn't feel are fair. The governor vetoes them. I don't know if that's going to happen. I'm not saying here that's going to happen, but if that happens, if that's one of the possible scenarios, if that happens, what comes next? And I think that's a useful thing for March 11th. So I think that the legislature, to circle back to your actual question, the legislature has hired those lawyers in anticipation of both drawing maps and probably litigation that follows from the maps. But again, I don't work for the legislature, and it really, you might think that we all are sort of political insiders that know everything, but they're in their own world there. So. Did that sufficiently answer your question?
Does it result in sort of disproportionate representation, if you will, if they're able to tap into taxpayer dollars on one side and those taxpayer dollars aren't available perhaps on this side or this side?
Yes, maybe so. I think that, the legislature at the end of the day controls how the budget process, and you're going to hear a little bit more about this when we're going to actually have the governor's policy director on in a few minutes to just talk about the budget process, about those 3 provisions I emailed about last night. So that's a bit separate, but, they control the budget process beyond the governor's proposal, and they've got the power to pay for their lawyers. And, without a line item in the budget to say pay for more things for this commission, and actually I have an update on that front too. Or for the, a commission of this kind or any work of this kind, there just simply isn't money. We can't, there's no way for the governor doesn't have unchecked spending authority, for instance. But I do want to give you guys just a quick update that it's very likely that Moon's group is going to be paid the money that she had originally requested, which is a pretty meager sum, but it's looking like we're able to work that out. So, but if you're asking me if I personally or the governor's office thinks it's fair that the legislature spends, I think the figure in the paper was something like $30,000 a month minimum on this law firm. I do not, and I know that the governor does not. So.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Regarding the hearing that we just had, guys, any other questions or I guess with any of the news that has just come out regarding the process? No, okay. All right. Jack, do we know what time the state budget process,
I had maybe misestimated. I asked her to come at 4:30.
Okay.
And if she could come earlier, to come earlier. If you guys don't mind, I don't think it would be inappropriate to maybe kind of start discussing and have her jump in. But if that seems hard to, too disruptive, I understand. So.
No, I think that's fine. I think I just want to respect everybody's time as much as possible, especially with what we have to accomplish here today. So
absolutely.
So we can go ahead and just start with the committee updates. As I said before, our most important action today is the Actions on Census and Line Drawing subcommittee that recently met last week and submitted the documents. Let me know if anyone needs another link out to the document that was sent out earlier this week. I can send it to you if you don't have it available to you, but I'll go ahead and turn it over to Tony right now.
Well, I think if everybody has the document, I don't really have too much to say. The notes from Moon, Dooch, and were very complete. We had a good meeting last week, and there was consensus among us who were at the meeting. And then Chris, you saw the notes and you were in consensus as well. So we felt at that point it should go to the whole commission to let them look at the potential criteria and, make comments, if necessary changes, talk about it, and then see if we could reach some overall consensus tonight. That was the plan.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if anybody has any questions about particular criteria, we could entertain those. Does anybody have any issues with the criteria, I guess, would be a question.
No.
Do you mind if we just take a little bit? I don't know about everyone else, but life is busy in between these meetings, so I haven't necessarily had a time to look in depth. So unless, Tony, if you don't feel like you have the capacity to just like summarize it briefly, if we could just
Sure.
take maybe 3 minutes so that I can.
Yeah, absolutely. I just didn't want to take extra time, but absolutely we can run through these quickly, Ben. So, I mean, Moon was extremely helpful. She had guided us, but it was the commissioners that made these decisions. And we, at the end of the meeting last week, we said, Moon, Liz, you guys have this in your head. Can you please write it down for us? So I would say it came from the commissioners. And so if we just go from the top, certain things are just non-negotiable, like compliance with Federal Voting Rights Act. We definitely have to follow that as required by federal law, and to nest the assembly districts 3-1 in the Senate districts, that's required. And then we debated and had talked about ranking other criteria by tiers, and within the highest priority, tier 1, we felt was contiguity, and I'll let you read that, and compactness. The district looks reasonable to the eye, and Moon's group has 3 different ways to score compactness. And then political boundaries. We've talked about this. We hear about it at hearings and meetings. Preserving the boundaries of counties and towns and wards whenever possible. And we did place that in the highest priority. And then next, as a high priority, would be communities of interest. I know there's a subgroup that's working on that, and we'll get more information on communities of interest. So we felt that was important. And as you see, Moon wrote down, the communities of interest may help make some decisions about how do we split certain counties. So that may help us in that way. We're going to split as few counties and cities as possible, but knowing the communities of interest may help us develop where we do the splits. And then we put population balance in the moderate range. I mean, we think it's important, and legally it's important, but to the extent that we respect all the prior higher criteria first, we feel like there is some flexibility in the population balance of 1 person or 1%. So let me just read this. We are trying to prioritize whole wards. We're trying to keep the wards intact over perfect population balance, for instance. All right. And then getting into the lower priorities, partisan fairness. So once we respect everything higher, then we would lean toward plans that lend themselves to proportional outcome, defined as where the share of representation for each party is roughly equal to the statewide share of support, relying on prior election data from 2015 to 2010. So, there's discussion of what is competitiveness, what is partisan fairness. I think that's still difficult. As she wrote, we're not going to emphasize competitiveness as a criterion at the expense of other priorities, which I think, saying that again, meaning our other priorities above are most important, and they'll probably take care of a lot of the partisan fairness to begin with. And we're not going to rig the maps to make that happen, is the point. And since I have the floor, I would also say this is also what's in the proposed legislation. Eventually, we'd like to see legislation that makes nonpartisan redistricting real. And clearly, both all of these criteria are in there and about this order, and there's specific wording, again, against using voter preference data in the legislative wording. So we're consistent with that. And then finally, on the second page, we're not putting any preference on plans that resemble the current plans which were gerrymandered in 2011. And then as an additional comment, we talked about, do we draw assembly lines first, or do we draw assembly and Senate lines together? But in the end, the commissioners on the subcommittee felt that first we draw the assembly districts and then group them to form the Senate districts. And that would be able to ensure the properties, the good properties that we're putting into the assembly districts already or automatically go to the Senate districts as well. So this was sort of the tiering and the ranking of the criteria that we felt. Any questions on that?
Thank you, Tony. I really appreciate you going through it. Very thorough. This is great work. I think another benefit of you going through it right now too is just for transparency purposes. We have this meeting, it's live, it's accessible going forward, and so people can hear that. I guess my question is just to clarify, so if we as a commission decide on these criteria, are we doing that, is the plan to do that today and then move forward, have this to be our criteria, or did, I'm just thinking of some of the commentary on transparency. We've had constituents voice concerns around, obviously, like the criteria itself has been one of the most common things discussed, right? And so I'm wondering if we did want to provide some time in terms of like publishing this in some way to let the constituents see what our criteria are and maybe open an opportunity for comment. I know obviously these criteria have taken into account all of the comments so far, but I'm thinking from a citizen perspective, I could feel some type of way if, you know, the criteria were agreed upon and it felt like the people didn't really have any comment, or, you know, we didn't publicize it first and then, you know, vote on it. You know what I'm saying? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, and other people can chime in. Yeah, I think that's a great idea, Ben. I mean, I think that if we reach consensus tonight, I think to me, it's sort of a working consensus as we get into the map drawing. And if we find that things just aren't working, we have the opportunity to modify some of these criteria. I don't know that we'll have to, but so to answer that question, you know, I don't think they're written in stone.
So,
but secondly, I agree with you that especially since we have a delay in getting the data, the census, it would be nice to kind of get these out there and get comment on them from common people, but also maybe the mayors and county boards, et cetera. They may be really happy to see these things. And, you know, it may put some influence on other people that are drawing maps, but I'll stop there.
No worries, no worries. I was gonna go to Howard, and then we'll go ahead and table it for right now because Ginny Dye is on here just to kind of give us an overview of the budget. But Howard, go forward, and then we'll
just very briefly. My suggestion is that if you can, if it's in your, you know, if it's your intention, that you reach some sort of a tentative agreement about it, very tentative. Not something that is over with. It's not something that's complete, but something that you can expose to the public for their comment. I think that's conventional rulemaking, and I think that it doesn't pin you down at all because you can always describe it as a tentative agreement. But otherwise, you don't move forward at all. There's no movement. It's just discussion.
Yeah.
So if in fact you don't have any, if no one here is dissenting from this recommendation, it would be good to recognize that, I think, in a sense for the record, and then put it out as something that you have tentatively agreed to and that you want to hear any advice people have about what you've tentatively agreed to. But not to keep just the discussion without any punctuation, just a constant discussion. That would bother me.
Yeah. All right, so guys, we'll go ahead and we'll let Jenny talk for a little bit here about our budget, and then we'll go from there. Jack, feel free if you're going to.
Yeah, I just wanted to first of all tell you all who Jenny Dye is. She's the policy director for the governor office. She's just finished the Herculean task of getting the governor's proposed budget announced. And like you all heard from me once, I think already today, and again in an email a night or two ago. It's not that we're asking you to do anything or anything regarding the governor's budget, but given that it had things related to the People's Maps Commission, we thought it would be useful for you to understand the process and to understand what it means that it's in the governor's budget. I also wanted to chime in and see that I see that Moon Duchin and Liz from MGGG arrived. I apologize to both of them because we are interrupting the discussion on criteria just for a quick primer on the state budget process. Just wanted to make sure you knew what was going on. So everybody, thank you for your patience on the whole, the back and forth schedule tonight. So, and Jenny, so thank you for being here, Jenny. Take it away.
Thanks, Jack. And thank you all for making a few minutes for this conversation during your meeting today. What I want to do is give you just a brief overview of sort of how the process unfolds from here with the budget, and then happy to take any questions at the end. But also want to be respectful of your time and let you get back to the business of the items that you're considering, especially since I'm sort of interrupting the flow. So in terms of the budget process, as Jack mentioned, the governor did introduce his budget last night. After the governor's speech, the Joint Committee on Finance, which is a committee of the legislature made up of both members of the Assembly and the Senate, did formally accept that bill for introduction, and that's a routine part of the process. What will happen next is that bill will be considered by the Joint Finance Committee over the series of many months. So the governor introducing the budget is really just the first step in that process. Already yesterday, legislators have certainly been vocal in the press about items in the budget that they're supportive of, or in some cases not so supportive of. So we know that there will be a lot of conversation about items in the budget over the next few months. The Joint Finance Committee typically has a series of public hearings over the course of the spring. I don't have details at this point to share with you about exactly what that public hearing format will look like. Obviously, with the continuing pandemic, it may be a little bit different than most years where they formally travel around the state and have hearings at different locations. And so we can certainly keep folks updated as more details are available about that process. After the public hearing process, then the Joint Finance Committee starts a series of meetings where they consider different sections of the budget on different days, typically organized by subject matter. So they might take up all of the higher education items on one day and all of the workforce and economic development items on another day, which allows stakeholders to be organized and engaged based on the types of issues that they care about. The Finance Committee will amend the governor's budget. In most processes, the vast majority of amendments happen at the committee level and not on the floor of the Assembly or the Senate later in the process. And so really the Joint Committee on Finance is the group of legislators that is tasked with putting together what ends up being very close to the final product that the legislature will vote on. During that process, they will take out things that the governor removes. And one of the typical first steps of that process is that they will identify items that they don't view as policy that's appropriate for the budget. And so those items come out in what's called a non-fiscal policy motion. I think there's a lot of debate about what policy is related to fiscal priorities and what isn't. And so there's not always agreement between the executive branch that's putting forward items in the budget and the legislative branch about those policies. And then after that initial motion, they would move into those subject matter discussions. In addition to that early public hearing process, there's also opportunities for citizens of the state to contact their legislators or to write in or contact the offices of members of Joint Finance to support or oppose particular items that are either in the governor's budget or items that the legislature might be considering adding to the budget. And then ultimately, usually in late spring or early summer, the legislature will pass a budget out of the Joint Finance Committee, and then it will go to the floor of one house. There may be some minor amendments at that point, but typically not significant changes to the budget process. The most significant changes historically have happened at the Joint Finance Committee. After one house passes it, much like every other bill, it will then go to the second house, assuming there are no additional amendments. Upon passage in that house, it would come to the governor for his signature or veto. One thing with the budget is that the governor is able to also utilize his line item veto power, which in Wisconsin is a very significant feature of our budget process. So that is also a review that is done by the governor before the process is finalized. I will add, in addition to that sort of formal process explanation, one of the things that I think is important for this group to understand, given your role in proposing nonpartisan, independent mapping processes, and in fact a map, that this process really is partisan, and certainly that's the function of the legislative and the executive branches. They are partisan branches of government, and as a result, often results in partisan debate. There's also a lot of things that we should have agreement on across the state of Wisconsin and that we do have bipartisan victories on, but ultimately this process can get quite partisan at times and is not strictly about process and numbers. It really is about some of the values that both parties bring to the table for debate. So I will pause there, and I'm happy to answer questions from members that you might have about the budget process.
Yeah, so the non-fiscal items, it seems like the budgetary items related to this commission and other items related to redrawing the maps, that seems a little like it could fall in that category. Are you sort of pointing that out because you think it might be one of the things that a committee sort of tries to eliminate from the budget?
Sure. What I can say on that is that last budget that the governor proposed 2 years ago did also include items related to independent redistricting, and those items were removed by the legislature in the process. So I don't want to make a prediction about what this legislature might do, but that is something that did happen with introduction last time.
Any other questions you guys have at this point or comments?
So if it is eliminated from the budget, will there be support, financial support for the committee to continue its work?
So I would say that, and certainly other folks who are on the call who staff this commission, feel free to jump in here, but the governor created the People's Maps Commission because he supports the work that this body is doing on fair maps, and certainly would continue to support that process. So from the perspective of drafting the budget, in drafting that, it was never the intention of the governor to impact the ongoing work of this committee. Instead, it was his intention to ensure that the work that this committee is continuing to do is considered by the legislature and that people have the opportunity to know more about your work. Jack, I see you've jumped on, so I don't know if you want to add anything there.
Well, just to the extent that the budget process isn't going to affect, like Jenny said, the actual work. Now, it's not going to affect it positively or negatively, I think, in that we are, as you all know, trying to do a lot with a little, and so far doing that, I think. And that this budget process likely isn't going to change that, but that's okay because we're still going to do a lot with a little. So that's the way I would put it.
Thank you.
Chair Ford, I have a quick question. That's okay. So I know that during the public hearing then for the budget, is that going to be something that would be appropriate for commission members to speak at, or any thoughts about that?
Sure. I will answer generally, and then Jack, if you want to jump in, or if anybody else from the team does, who has more familiarity with your commission on a regular basis, please feel free. But obviously, these are opportunities for any resident of Wisconsin to make their voice heard about the process. And so I think, that's something that is important. I think also really important that this commission's work continues to be that independent voice for the mapping process. And so I think there's a balance to be struck there about how to approach advocacy for the fair map process that obviously involves decisions in the legislative and the executive branch that you all, as residents of the state and members of this commission, may have strong feelings about, but also making sure to maintain the integrity of the independence of this process.
Anyone have any other questions or comments about the process at this point? Okay. All right, well, Jenny, thank you so much for coming out and taking time to discuss it with us here. Jack, did you have something? Sorry, I see you. No, okay. All right. Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
All right. So I guess we can jump back in with, I see Moon and Liz are here now too. So with discussion with our criterion here. Ben, did you have any more comment about what Howard said? I know that I saw your comments in the comment box, but.
No, I think Howard, thank you for that advice. Always, thank you for advice. Appreciate it. It makes a lot of sense. I don't know if Moon and Elizabeth were actually in here when I asked my initial question, but essentially it was like, is this criteria something that we're going to set in stone tonight, or is it, as Tony I think said, it's sort of a working criteria that may need to be adjusted? And then how do we address the transparency, making sure that the public knows that this is the criteria we're working with and able to leave comments on it or give us feedback? And so I think Tony and Howard both did a good job answering. So
I'll just add that from our point of view, tentative is great. We just need to get the ball rolling on our modeling, but are happy to kind of adapt as we go, especially because we think it's likely that you'll learn that if it's hard to get everything all at once, that might adjust your thinking about the priorities. So that's an expected and healthy part of the process, is to revisit as we go.
Yeah. And one thing that we could consider too, especially if we keep it as tentative and as plastic as possible at this point in time, is that we can say that this is tentative criteria that we have here and offer any avenues for public perspective and also comment on it too. And so that may be something now that we are transitioning to the next stage of being a commission, kind of going from the data acquisition stage to now we're applying it to our map processing. Something that we can leave here and then propose that to the public so they can continue to have that transparency, continue to have that input too.
For my part, I can predict 2 different kinds of feedback you're likely to get. So maybe I'll just sort of surface those now and see how you feel. So I think you're likely to get 2 opposing opinions at least, on the partisan fairness piece. Let me just tell you what I anticipate those might be. Some people are going to feel, with respect to the tentative placement, that it's to be considered last, and only while the other things are, the other criteria are satisfied as well as possible. You'll definitely have some people who say that's way too low. It's really important. You should bring it right up top. It's fundamental. So that's one. I expect you to hear that from some folks. On the other hand, some people will want you not to take it into account at all. And I guess another camp that's worth mentioning is people who will find that proportionality, the idea that if possible, you should get representation roughly equal to the share of support. Some folks are going to push back that that's naive. I want to kind of discuss that with you, that's a school of thought out there, especially in academic political science. People say proportionality, well, sure, that's everyone's untrained intuition, but we know better. Instead, we should be doing these fancier things. We should be doing these efficiency gap things, or we should be doing these partisan symmetry things. And I just want to say, from my perspective as someone who works full time on this, I don't think that's right. I don't think it's naive at all to try to aim for something where the share of representation looks approximately like the share of votes. That doesn't mean it's the only thing out there, but I think you should resist the critique that that's naive and that fancier things are automatically better.
Well, can I have you just explain again, what do you mean by one person balance? I've never understood that now for the last month or two.
Oh, sure. So let me click to the survey of the actual balance levels that are currently observed in different states. I'll share my screen once I find it. Here we go. So here's the table that was prepared by NCSL, the National Conference of State Legislatures, showing what the actual population balance is in all states for their 2010 plan. And look at this overall range number of people. So you see in this column for the congressional district, you see a whole lot of ones and zeros. Not all, but a lot of ones and zeros. And what that means, and here's Wisconsin, what that means is that every single congressional district that was enacted last time is either 710-873 or 710-874. They're all within 1% of each other. Not 1%, but 1%. And that's something you can kind of only do with a computer, is get that level of balance. Now, the folks at the Census Bureau, the ones who actually put the numbers together, they understand, first of all, the numbers they assemble at the beginning of a decade, obviously, population shifts will have made those less accurate by the middle of, in fact, just about instantly. They won't be perfect, just about instantly. Nonetheless, this is the practice in most states. Now, some states you'll see a much bigger number, and let me highlight, for instance, West Virginia, which has a much bigger deviation from congressional district to congressional district, and that was challenged and upheld in court. So basically, West Virginia said, we have a good reason for this, which has to do with where people live and with other representational goals that we have. And the court said, fine, that's okay. So even 4,871 person deviation has been found to be legally defensible if you have a good reason for it. And that's basically the story here. You have a choice of whether to seek one person balance or whether to say, if we have 32 person balance like Texas, but we're keeping wards whole, we're going to call it a day. That's basically the choice you have to make there.
Okay. And the way we've ranked our criteria would be that yeah, we want one person balance, but we're going to be flexible based on higher rank criteria.
That's exactly how I read what the note from that last conversation is, that things like communities of interest or preserving wards and towns whole are more important than getting to that one person balance. And similarly for the state house and state senate, if you look down these numbers, these are now percentages. And so you see, there are states that get to perfect balance even for all their districts. But you know, Hawaii has a big deviation, but of course that's partly to do with the island structure in Hawaii. People don't want to break up islands unless they have to. And so you have a choice there. You can get, so if you look currently at Wisconsin, it's under 1% deviation even for the Assembly and the Senate districts. And so that was the question there too. Do you want to maintain that extremely tight balance, or will you let the higher ranked, sometimes would it be possible to let the higher ranked criteria give you a reason where you'd go past 1% and maybe you'd go to 4 or 5% like you see in a lot of other states?
I'll ask another question. So if we give you these criteria tonight as a consensus, what are you doing with them?
If you go look higher up in the memo, we tell you exactly what we're doing with them, which is just, we're gonna build these criteria into our models and build them into our maps that we make for you. So I should say, we're not making maps for you. We're not making districting plans for you. That's your job. But we're making mapping software for you so that you can start to draw in it. Right. And so whatever you tell us about these rules will be reflected in the software that we hand you to draw with.
I saw Ruben have his hand up.
Yeah.
Go forward.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Moon, can you talk some more about the partisan balance?
Mm-hmm.
So with the partisan balance, you won't have like a variation that is like out of bounds. You know what I mean? Or maybe explain that, because I think that we need to have, I mean, some partisan balance. If we see like something that's totally out of whack, you know, we ought to be able to take that into consideration. But help me understand, I guess to my colleagues, you know, why we put, you know, partisan balance, you know, as the last criteria. But I'd like to understand more about the notion of partisan balance from you and how that plays in to the calculation.
Absolutely. So the reason I was a little late joining you tonight is that I was teaching a class about this. And so let me pull up what I was just showing my students. So I'm teaching a voting class at Tufts this semester. I have 80 very fresh-faced undergraduates. It's a lot of fun. And we were just talking about this tonight. We were talking about what kind of partisan balance can you expect? So I'm going to share my screen and show you what I was just showing them. I'll be really brief. I won't give you a whole giant spiel, but the pair of states that I talked to my students about tonight was Maryland and Massachusetts. So let me tell you what I'm about to show you. Maryland and Massachusetts have very similar voting patterns in the last 20 years. Both states favor Democrats in the presidential and US Senate contests at a rate of about 2-to-1. So in both Maryland and Massachusetts, you see about 65-35 or 67-33. You see about a 2-to-1 rate of favoring Democrats. So let's see what that looks like in Maryland. And here's, I think this makes it really clear. At least it seemed to work on my students tonight. Tell me what you think. So here's a Maryland governor's election. And so you see a lot of red in the rural parts of Maryland and then some blue near DC and in Baltimore. It's maybe about what you'd expect. And then if you flip to, say, a Senate election, that's a much more Democratic looking map, but it still looks to your eye about evenly balanced. But the fact is, in 2016 Senate, if you go to partisan balance here, it was about a 2/3, 1/3 Democratic outcome. It just doesn't look that way to your eye because the rural parts of the state take up a lot of space in your eye. You see what I'm saying so far? It's about 2-to-1.
Yeah.
Okay, and now let's switch to Massachusetts, which I claim is about the same. So let's take a quick look at Massachusetts. We'll look at congressional districts. And the example I was just using to show my students was the 2006 Senate race. So before I show you the picture here, let's take a look at the 2006 Senate race and see. So this was Teddy Kennedy against a challenger named Chase. And it's also about 2-to-1, roughly 2-to-1, a little better than 2-to-1. But now if we actually visualize it, it looks really different. The state looks totally blue, even though it's just 2-to-1. And so I asked my students, like, where are the Republicans hiding in this map? And the answer is they're thinly spread out everywhere. So the state of Massachusetts is had cast about 1/3 Republican votes, but it was 1/3 of the state and 1/3 of every town and 1/3 of every precinct. It was just really uniformly spread around the state. Okay. So Ruben, to answer the question about what does this mean for us when we're thinking about a fair plan? In Massachusetts, there is no way to draw a Republican district. Look at this map. If you were going to grab these precinct units and try to make yourself a Republican district, you could not do it. There isn't enough red in the map to go around. And so Massachusetts has been sending an all Democratic delegation to DC for 27 years, since 1994. Total futility for Republicans, but that's not a gerrymander. It's because it's just not possible to get to a Republican district. It can't be done because of where the votes lie. Okay, but if we were to flip back to Maryland, it is possible. And so the point of view that I read your statement of criteria to be making is you shouldn't sacrifice every other, in Massachusetts, we could try disconnected districts, we could break up precincts, we could go really far trying to represent those Republicans, right? But you'd have to do that. You'd have to break all the traditional criteria to make a Republican district here. It's just it's very hard to do because of where the votes are. And so that's how I read a decision to put partisan fairness last. It says, we're not going to sacrifice all of these other principles just to get to proportionality if the votes are distributed in a way that makes the range of possibilities for districts disproportional. Then the best we can do is try to aim for proportionality within what's possible as dictated by our other rules.
But
Does that make sense?
yeah, it does, but aren't some states more suitable to
Yes.
partisan balance than others? And then it's because the two comparisons that you showed, that was clear that one of these states was more suitable. And I would ask the question about Wisconsin. Is Wisconsin more
Yes.
suitable for the partisan?
I'll show you what I know about Wisconsin so far. So I've been thinking exactly about that question. But then this is part of when I say, you give me the rules and I'll do the modeling. Once you tell me the criteria, we're going to make you millions of maps following your criteria. And then we're going to look at those maps and say, okay, can you get proportionality without breaking your other rules? And here's what I know so far. I did an early run of this just to get a sense of how this is going to go. And here's what I learned about Wisconsin. Just pulling up that map. So I modeled this using just very simple criteria. I modeled this in Wisconsin for your 2016 voting patterns. Oh, here it is. And here's what I found. So this is just for Congress. So I was looking at 8 district maps of Wisconsin. And what I found is that you guys in 2016, both the presidential race was very close to 50-50, and your Senate race that same year was very close to 50-50. But when we randomly made lots of districts that were compact, contiguous, and balancing population, what we found is a slight tendency to be a little more Republican than the state as a whole. So if you look at how people voted, this is Clinton versus Trump. Yeah, you can get a 4-4 map. It's a little more likely to get a 3-5 map, or even a 2-6 map can happen. So there's a little bit of a tilt in the playing field that just has to do where people live, just has to do with where people live. But if you want a proportional map, if that's all the way at the bottom of your list of criteria, what this is telling you is you can do it. And so you could, choosing among all these competitors that all follow the rest of the rules really well, you could select one that would have been proportional under this voting pattern. It's harder to do under the Senate voting pattern. It's much harder to make a 4-4 map, but you can still do it. You can see there's a little, if I zoom in, there's a little bar there. It's possible to do it. And so the question is, how much do you want to, within the world constructed by all the rest of your criteria, how important will it be to pick one that would have given a proportional outcome under recent elections? I want to say you're in much better shape than a lot of other states. Let me show you some examples. Like, here's a few other states. Well, there's Massachusetts, like I just told you. Mm-hmm. All you can do is make an all Democratic map. There's nothing else you can do in Massachusetts if people vote like they did for president. But there's some other states where the effect is really strong. where things are pulled the red line is proportionality. So things are pulled kind of away from proportionality by the geography, like in Ohio, for instance. Look at this pattern here. It's pulled really far away. Wisconsin, you're in pretty good shape. You can get proportionality if you try, but not by accident. You're probably not going to get proportionality unless you pay attention to it.
Thank
Does
you.
that help a little bit?
Oh, that helped tremendously. Thank you. I think our team made the right decision. Thank you.
I guess any other thoughts on our criterion or any comments or? Yeah, go ahead, Tobias.
Yeah, so if we're all in consensus, then does this, and and I agree, I completely agree with it. I think I agree that it should be kind of fluid as we kind of move forward. But is it something that we then develop as like a cute little PDF, or how do we then kind of roll that out? And, during a hearing so that other people get to know, or has there been any thought on that? And, two, I think that then we need to be thoughtful then as to the kind of the wording that we use, because we understand why this partisan fairness is number 4, right? So I was so glad that, Moon, you had stated that, this is going to be the critique that we get back. And I think a lot of that might be just not understanding, our process or our thoughts behind it. So I'm just kind of hoping that, we'll at least have that opportunity to kind of like fully, disclose this is where we're coming from because of all of these other tiers. This is why this is coming in forth. But it doesn't mean that, we're just putting the kibosh on it or that it'll stay that way, forever. So those are just kind of my thoughts about that moving forward.
Yeah, it's something that we can discuss and going forward in terms of trying to relay it to the community. We can all just send out a course description and a link to Moon's class. Maybe that'll help.
All my lectures are online.
There you go. So, but no, it's something actually been discussing the last couple of weeks about how we're going to roll this out. And one of the ideas is discussed before was potentially saying this is a preliminary criteria that we've come up with, and then creating either a section on the website or a handout or something like that, just to say if you have any questions or any concerns or want any more information, then we can definitely go into discussion about it. So yeah, Tony. I think you're on mute, big guy.
Like Elizabeth mentioned, I guess I just have some issues with the specific wording and how it's perceived out there in the public. But I wonder first if we've said that we have consensus. I mean, is anybody not in consensus?
I don't see any dissent from our consensus here. I think we're all in agreement and going forward, unless I can't see Ben, but I don't hear anything.
Then I'll ask my question.
There you go.
The last one, what?
I got a thumbs up from Ben. Sorry, he clicked in.
Okay, so preserving district cores, just in terms of how it's going to be perceived by both the public and other legislators that may read this. Do we need to put in there partially because of a desire to avoid favoring incumbents? I think as soon as they read that, they're like, oh, no way. So I wonder if we just stop it after there will be no preference for plans that resemble the current enacted plans, period.
That makes sense.
That's fair. Yeah.
I think you stay away from that. This is a objective analysis, regardless of whether it impacts incumbents or not. I think you stay away from that. That leans towards being more political.
That's what I'm saying too, Ruben, is take that out of there.
And
Yeah, go for it.
So maybe the thing is that now that you have agreed tentatively to these priorities, and can I just say, I think it's important to stress that what you've agreed to is really priorities. Okay, they are criteria, but the criteria are the criteria that everybody has. There's no controversy at all about what should be the criteria. The question is what should be the priorities.
Yeah.
So I think you do, when you do explain yourself, you've got to make sure you don't leave out that word, which you're tending to do right now. Is to leave out so you really need to, people need to know that these are our priorities. And that I think does imply that there's some capacity to sort of dial this up and dial that down. Okay, which is the point that I think everybody is making. My process suggestion would be that now that you have agreed to this tentatively, the system of priorities tentatively, someone needs to put before you a draft of a text, so that just as Tony, just as you're suggesting, you edit it for the reader, not inside the group, but for the reader, so that there aren't any unintended implications in the text. And then put the text in front of your colleagues, and if you want to edit it again, fine, but we don't have anything right now in text form. This is a really important and I think really difficult conversation about how to get something that is sort of technical and complicated, that you know is technical and complicated, and everybody else thinks is obvious and simple. And all I would say about that is don't pretend like it's simple, because it's not. Okay, if you try to simplify it, you'll distort it. It isn't by nature simple, and so you don't really. It isn't in the spirit of public disclosure to distort something by any means, including by simplifying it. And so this is daunting, I think, to try to get across all the nuances and subtleties of what you're doing and what you're confronting. But I don't think you're going to be able to sugarcoat it, and I don't think you're going to be able to make it simple, because it just isn't.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I would say is, though, I think that if you write a text, one of you will spot every part of that text that might be unfortunate. Some one of you will spot something. If there's something in there that is unfortunate, one of you is going to spot it, and you'll take it out. So that's why I would think having a text would be helpful.
Well, I'd be happy to tackle that with Anne Marie, maybe the project manager. I don't know, Anne Marie, how do you feel about that? And then,
Yeah, I was just thinking the same thing, Tony, that this document that Moon has that you were just describing earlier in our meeting would be the source, and that we could just kind of write that as for the layman without simplifying it, as Howard says. But yeah, I think, do you want me to give a first draft of something and send it to you, and then you can propose something to the group?
yeah, we can talk about it. I mean, yeah. But obviously, we appreciate Moon's work, and it's going to look almost exactly what she put together.
Yes.
So, which, for the record, came from the commissioners, but Moon and Liz wrote it up. So.
And
Yeah.
do you have a glossary that you might recommend that we put as an appendix to this? Sort of a not our definitions, but definitions that are widely accepted that we could include?
Yes, we do have a criteria glossary, and I will get that to you. I could get that to you today in one form, but let me give it another reading and get it to you in a few days.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I think that that's important, especially when we talk about communities of interest, because people define that in a lot of ways. And I think maybe we need to spend a fair amount in our little PDF or trifold, or however we're going to get this out into the community, on what it is, and maybe a few examples about what it isn't too. So
we have a glossary on the website as well, under the educational materials, on the wisconsin.gov/peoplesmaps website, if you want to take a look at that too, and that perhaps can be combined with whatever Moon has to support that.
yeah, I guess.
Yeah, then we'll want to make sure we have one source of truth on that going forward.
Exactly. We might have to edit the website if it comes to that.
One thing I just wanted to chime in and say is that I had been talking to Molly Vidal a little bit behind the seats while you're all talking. And this seems like something, if we're interested in it, that with sufficient planning, that not something to just throw together, but that we might want to have a separate, with all our extra time, I mean, I don't mean to say that we're not unlimited here, but with some of this extra time, we might want to have a little bit like not hearing necessarily, but like webinar sort of deal, and really be deliberate about the way we take input on these things, because, and Molly, feel free to chime in, but it seems to me that this is, like you've all been saying, pretty technical and evokes knee-jerk reactions. Like if you'd asked me 2 years ago about competitiveness, I'd have been like, that has to be number one. And I don't personally agree with that anymore. And I certainly don't second guess where you guys put it in the list, but it means we might not want to have, like, say, open-ended input, but instead a rating system. And that was, by the way, Molly's idea, not mine. So I think you guys are in the right space. I just wanted to offer that up as an idea of, a way to take some input on these that is controlled, but gets true feelings about them, if that makes sense.
Just a point of clarification. So what are we going to do? Are we going to say that, we consent, tentatively, so that this work can move forward? Or are we going to wait for something to come back, from the subcommittee, then say that we move forward tentatively? And then what are the next steps from there in terms of getting the public engagement or public information? Are we going to do a presentation to the public so that they understand what we ended up with, take feedback, and then what are we going to start running the maps? Just curious.
Yeah. So, it's my understanding in that we're going to move forward tentatively with this criterion that we've come up with and that we've all agreed upon here. And then we are talking now about next steps in terms of getting additional information and kind of doing a rollout, looking at it from a couple different perspectives here too. How does this dovetail into the community of interest? How do we go about rolling it out? It's something that Molly had been discussing as well. It just seemed going forward, and it's what Jack is talking about too. Molly, I know you had some input that you wanted to say too.
No, I just put it in the chat. I think there is a draft sort of engagement outreach plan, comms plan related to the collection of the maps and the communities of interest, and like how do we sort of engage folks and provide tools. I think it wouldn't be much of a extra lift to sort of weave this into a more comprehensive strategy so that all of the different documents fit together and look alike and sound alike. And that when we're engaging the different community organizations or whoever we decide to engage, everyone is sort of saying the same thing to different groups, and that we're not accidentally one-off explaining something. So it wouldn't be much. I know Anne Marie and Chair Ford have seen that. It wouldn't be much to sort of roll this into that, I don't think.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Chair, I know we're not using parliamentary procedures, but I would call for the vote, for this tentative moving forward first, and then continue the discussion from there.
Yeah, I think in this format, Commissioner Anthony, I think that just starting out with a criterion that we all, can agree upon, it gives us some of that plasticity if we don't say, definitively this is going to be our criterion for a vote. That way we can make changes in going forward, right? And so that was some of the discussion points that we have been having before in the past, is to not lock specific commissioners into a voting format, into saying this is what we want our criterion to be. This is why we didn't go with a ranking technique behind it. So I don't know how do others feel about that.
So I'm not necessarily calling for an official vote to say 8-1 or 8-2 or 5-6-2. Right. I just want to close this out, that part out, and just say, we agree that on this part that we need to move forward, and then start talking about next steps.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, Ruben, I think the scheme is fairly settled in the sense that if you have a consensus, which you seem to have, to agree to this tentatively, okay, and I know tentative makes it sort of ambiguous, but it is what it is until it's changed, is what tentative means. And so then you have something to move forward on. Ultimately, you will be asking for what you just said, okay? But what's happening here is that you're building something that you can be more increasingly confident of, and then ask the kind of question that you're asking. It's just that it seems premature to get really settled on something that's identified as tentative. And that's just a familiar, it's a conventional process, but as you say, it's not parliamentary. The problem with parliamentary is that you're going to have some losers.
No, I'm tentative too, but I want to be sure that piece is going to, have the ability to go forward so that we can advance the work.
Yeah. So Chris, isn't it the case that it is now a matter of record for this particular meeting?
Right.
That that's a decision that's been taken by the body, right? Because there's no dissent. I think you have it there. I think you got what you want.
I'll say, if I could, I'll just say from my point of view, I have what I need to do the next steps. With one wrinkle, which is on contiguity, what's next to what. I'm going to be reaching out through Jack, I guess is the right person for me to go through, to several of you individually to ask about like what's next to what in your district, in your part of the state. So you should expect to hear some questions from us when we're not sure what should count. And those also don't have to be set in stone, but just tentatively. So I know like Jason, this and that, it was really helpful to hear about the Apostle Islands and like what we should think about as next to what. And I'll be asking some questions, some clarifying questions like that to each of you. Other than that, I have what I need to start some modeling for you.
All right. Any other questions or comments before we move on, guys?
I just had a.
Yeah.
I just want. Oh, sorry. I want to make sure.
No, go for it. Go for it.
Okay. I just wanted to the point around getting rid of. I think Tony or Ruben might have been talking about the getting rid of like the partially because of a desire to avoid favoring incumbents, and maybe we're getting too much in the nitty gritty. I think that was something that was discussed by constituent testimony. And Tony, from what I remember just earlier in the meeting, you had said getting rid of that so that like from maybe a state like the legislatures wouldn't see that, or like the current members of the legislature wouldn't see that and be turned off by it. In my mind is like, well, we're this is the people's maps, and if the people's testimony has said that we should avoid drawing lines to favor incumbents, then that's what we should include in the language versus getting rid of the language to make it seem more appealing to members of the legislature. Does that make sense?
It does.
That's just my 2 cents. I see it like crossed out already in the criteria document, and I wanted to advocate to keep it in, but that's just my individual perspective.
I don't know then.
I'll go for it, Don.
I don't.
Oh,
I had the opinion to take it out, so now you have 2 opinions. I don't know what to do with that.
Well,
I was just going to suggest we could put it in, and a lot of times it's how you phrase things. If you phrase it in a more positive way than a negative way. But I would say maybe we can start by, as we kind of write this more for the layman, we can start with leaving everything in, don't change it, and then send it to the group and then have them decide whether it's written clearly, our intent comes through properly. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I think, especially with as much as we're sort of deciding on tentatively at this point in time, we're not going to get through it all, in one sitting. And it's definitely something that we all have to see in that document that we come up with, as Anne-Marie was saying, as Tony was saying, and kind of make a decision on how that will be interpreted and going forward. And so, there's a lot of things to consider with this iteration of it, but, I think that we have a consensus in going forward. And as Moon said, we can kind of move forward with some of the data that we have right now. So, okay. Yeah, Anne-Marie.
Just one more thing on the same topic, the idea of giving a presentation during the hearing about how we prioritized our criteria might be really good to do that before we roll anything out, and kind of make that sort of official. It'll be recorded, anyone can listen to it, and we can go into a little depth about why we chose and whether we open that for questions and answers, that's another thing to discuss. But
Yeah.
I think a good rollout during a hearing would be the best.
Yeah, that's something we can discuss. I'll go for it. Yep.
No, I'm sorry if I missed this, but would we run some test maps based on these criteria before we go out with this and just kind of do our own checking?
Yeah, go ahead, Mono. Sorry.
Oh, I was gonna say I could get you a batch of maps to look at sooner, or hold off so that you can, because you might prefer to open it up to public comment before.
I
Drawing
just feel
up
like
maps.
maybe before, during, after, it just to sort of help us feel more confident in what we're going out with.
Sounds great. Just say the word. We have our kind of modeling apparatus set up, but we're waiting for you to tell us when it's time to start drawing.
Yeah. No, line draws subcommittee, what do you guys think? Do you think it'll be a good idea just to have something at least to look at in order to kind of decide if this is the route that we want to go in terms of creating a whole rollout process for our criteria that we have?
I would like to see the criteria rolled out through mapping to see what it's looking like.
At least in a preliminary, but yeah, Marie.
Yeah, I think we talked a little bit in the last line drawers about maybe having a map that tries to keep counties as whole as possible. And I know, Moon, you were going to try to generate a few of those maps too for us. And I think that would be good for whatever public outreach that we're doing, because that's kind of the Iowa plan. And we know people think that's a good plan. And maybe we could use those demonstration maps as showing why it's not such a good plan here in our area.
Do.
Yeah.
And
Would
so, sorry.
advocate, if possible, to not roll this out until after you're done with your congressional district hearings. We could do a separate hearing related to this, but I think it's important that all the folks in the hearings get their feedback in before we roll it out.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah.
Go for it, Tony.
Yeah, I was just gonna say we could kind of do both things. Anne Marie and I could start to work on some of the wording. We're not going to tweak a lot, but she had a good idea of making it more positive. At the same time, Moon could give us a few maps with the criteria that we're having consensus on tonight, and just giving confidence that, yeah, they seem to work. So we can kind of do both. And then, like Molly just said, we have a month for that before we have the final hearing. So.
I do think we should hear from the 2nd Congressional District before we roll out the maps.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, as we said to begin with, we have, unfortunately, have a lot more time to work with. And so this is something that we can definitely, dedicate once we've gone through all the districts, once everyone has had the opportunity individually in the districts to have their testimony and to hear from our experts. We can kind of approach it from a macro level, right? Saying, now this is what we're considering. This is how we've interpreted all that.
But I was thinking internally, if we could start to look at some maps that,
oh, absolutely. Yeah,
not something we'd roll out to the public.
Okay. All right. Any other thoughts, guys, before we move on to those subcommittees?
Yeah, I'm still thinking that folks in the 2nd Congressional District might feel a certain way. If we start even finalizing the criteria and looking before we get their input, so if we want to be whole, I think we should wait to hear from the 2nd Congressional District too.
In terms of finalizing it, what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah, so no, we haven't finalized our criteria at this point in time. This is just something, tentatively that we've discussed as a commission so that we can give, the MGGG group something to kind of as a working template for how we are going to start considering our maps here. We haven't set anything in stone. That was kind of the, our overarching goal today is to just get something to start with, right? And so, if we hear from, some of our Wisconsinites that have different opinions about it, and we'll definitely take it into consideration. But we're not setting anything in stone right now.
No, I know it's not set in stone, but I'm just still saying it's only fair to hear from all of the congressional districts before we kind of even advance to that level. I was anxious during this meeting to kind of move forward, but whoever brought up, I think it was Molly who brought up the fact that let's get through all the congressional districts. I'm in congressional district 2, and we haven't heard from congressional district 2. Maybe there might be, some things that they might bring that might alter, and I guess there'll be an opportunity to change, to adjust based on what they bring in. So maybe it's splitting hairs.
Well, I guess any other thoughts you guys have at this point, or I think we got a good path right now with what we have consensus on at this point. So, all right, guys. So we'll go ahead and we'll move, because I want to get to the other subcommittees too, because they have some other things to bring up as well. And so, Commissioner, do you have anything for expert selection? I don't think that we have anything at this point in time for subcommittee. No. Okay. Outreach and engagement. Ben, do you guys have anything?
Yeah, so
I may say goodnight.
Thanks. Sorry about that.
No problem. I'll just, we're on call, so just let us know if you have data queries, and I already have a list of IOUs from tonight, and we'll get right back to you.
You're the best. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming out. All right, Ben, go for it, sir.
Yeah, so I just want to first by apologizing for not being at the last working meeting. So I'm not 100% in terms of what from the outreach committee has gotten out. So Elizabeth and I, and actually Elizabeth, Molly, and I all met on February 2nd. And so I think if Elizabeth and Molly, there's something you all have already covered when it comes to the outreach in that meeting, it could be good to chime in maybe, or do you think I should just share sort of the outcomes from that meeting, Elizabeth?
I think we did, between Molly and I, we shared our outcomes and kind of our discussion from that meeting. So I think we're pretty covered.
Good. Okay. And so I think from my perspective, this is sort of on the ball. Elizabeth and I haven't talked about it. From an outreach perspective, there's a few things that just have emerged from this meeting that it sounds like we might already have had a decision on. So in terms of sharing the criteria as we go further along that process, the outreach in terms of sharing that criteria, is that going to fall on the criteria committee, or is that going to fall on the outreach committee? That's my first question to the commission.
Yeah, I think probably it would be best to have you guys work with Molly on that. And Molly had already discussed a little bit about some of the outreach strategy.
Yeah.
So it may be good just to have you guys sync up and come up with a plan of attack, so to speak, and kind of present it to the commission afterwards. But
and Molly's strategy, I mean, it would make sense to me too. So I'm on board with that. She had sent the document.
Yeah, I sent the draft to everyone in the link. So it's a working one that we can be in, and you can see where there's still sort of like questions we need to hash out. But what I'll do is I'll take that and start adding on bits and pieces for Commissioner Rangel and Commissioner Tobias to look at, to see how they feel about it, and then get feedback and then share it with the group.
Great, that works really well. And so I guess I'll just, from a personal perspective, I would recommend for outreach purposes to have a specific hearing later after the CD hearings. I know this was mentioned already, but I just want to say I'm fully supportive of the idea of having a specific outreach hearing where we invite the members to come in, where we present the criteria, maybe a little background, ask Moon to be present, and then we have a public comment period, just like we would normally, but specific to the criteria. That would be really powerful. The second thing from this meeting is encouraging support for the independent redistricting part of the governor's budget. I can see if we want to, as a commission, where we could do some outreach on the independent level within our districts, reaching out to different community organizations, our elected officials, so on and so forth, advocate that they support. Granted that I know that it was mentioned earlier, I think by, what's the woman who presented the budget? Sorry, her name is Jenny. Which, you know, shout out to her for conducting that whole thing and then having the time to come out and speak with us as well. It's amazing work. But she had mentioned that us reaching out as individuals versus us reaching out as a commission, you know, we should tread lightly there. But I think it could be worth, in terms of outreach, coordinating some sort of support for that part of the governor's budget to our elected officials, whether or not it's as a commission or as independent citizens. That's up to us, but that's the only thing that I have for outreach.
Can I?
Yeah, go for it, Al.
I hope this isn't outside of my role here, but I think you heard a very diplomatic cautionary note about the Joint Finance Committee. I have some experience with it, and I will tell you, it is a place to get punished. Okay, it isn't just a place to get rejected, it's a place to get punished. So if you feel, you better feel very sophisticated if you're going to enter that room with those people. Because when she said it's partisan, she didn't just mean there are votes that go on. What she meant is it's the ultimate sort of partisan contest where people sort of exact, they get revenge in there. I'll put it that way. They punish. I used to run an agency. If they didn't like what the agency would do, I would lose staff in there. And they have no obligation to explain what they're doing. And they are respected by the rest of the legislature to the point where they tell the rest of the legislature what's going to happen. Okay, so I would just say you've heard a word to the wise, although it was fairly diplomatic, and you ought to process it that way. That's just all I would say about it. If you get bold in there, you might wind up losing more than you thought you had at stake.
So Howard, just to revoice what you're saying, you think that maybe if the commission makes an effort to influence their decisions around the budget and keep that line item, it could backfire. Granted, it seems likely that they might remove it anyways because of the non-fiscal component. Am I hearing that right, Howard?
Yeah.
Okay, and then Molly, I know you have experience working with the same folks.
It might be a good idea, maybe for Commissioner Rangel and Commissioner Tobias and I to sit down and kind of talk through like what would our end goal be with sort of engagement on the state budget process, and then work backwards from, if this is our end goal, then how do we get there? Because there's a lot of different ways to engage within the budget process. And so we should talk through all the different options that gets you to your ultimate end goal.
Yeah, and even just hearing you say that, Molly, I think there's more urgency from my personal perspective in outreach in terms of our work in general, and outreach in terms of the, now that we're getting close to having a criteria. Like, I think the budget process is important, but if, knowing we're all volunteers, right? If it's more work than it needs to be, I would rather spend our work on the outreach for the other work we're doing, the good work we're doing, and the criteria stuff. And so I just wanted to throw that out there to any of the other commissioners in case they felt strongly.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, Ben, I think you're right. I mean, I just also had the thought of, the hearing where we talk about criteria, eventually it'd be great to have at something, just a summary of all the comments that we had. And my gosh, we had over 300 comments and all these experts. I mean, there's a lot of ways that we can advertise ourselves.
Yeah.
Great. And so I think from the outreach committee perspective, Molly, if you're available again in the coming weeks, just to update the commission, there's quite a bit of things we talked about in our February 2nd meeting. And I know personally, even as a member of the outreach committee, would like to just circle back to some of them. For instance, like providing information, whether they're social graphics and stuff in a different language. Molly, that was something you suggested, right? Can we get it in Spanish and Hmong and Somali? I think stuff like that is really important, and I just want to make sure the commission knows that I am not losing sight of a lot of these ideas, and you know, doing whatever we can with limited capacity, knowing we can't, you know, be on the social media, have our own page or anything like that, doing whatever else we can to get the work out there. So Tony, to your point, yeah, I think you know, summarizing the post hearing summary was something that Molly, Elizabeth, and I all thought of. What would that look like? Is that something we could do for the upcoming hearing, or something we could do for the last hearing? I don't know, but there's a lot on my mind still for outreach. So
I think as we head into that, as we complete all of the hearings, we sort of move into a next engagement and strategy sort of phase. And so I think as we close out one, that's when we can use the sort of summary of all of your work and all the things you learned. We can individualize some of that things by your different districts and for all of your engagement and outreach you would like to do. And then we move into the next phase, which is getting the feedback on the criteria, on the people submitting maps, and on the communities of interest. So we sort of trigger at the end of the hearing sort of the transition to the next part of your work.
I love that. That's a good idea. Great. And then the only other thing I will say is, I think Ruben, you said that your CD is coming up next, right?
Yes.
Just look out from we've talked about, Elizabeth and Molly and I talked about sort of just like small things the commissioner from the CD can do leading up to the hearing. And these might be things you're already doing, but just a little local outreach. And so I can follow up with you independently about that. But it paid off when I reached out to some folks before my hearing that ended up testifying. And so, yeah, just keep an eye out for that. And that's all I have, unless Elizabeth and Molly have something.
Yeah. So,
6 CD is next, right? I just want to make sure.
No,
Okay.
no,
Mr. Prentice and I are meeting tomorrow. Yeah, I think Mr. Prentice and I are meeting tomorrow.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Yeah, so 6th and then 2nd.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Great. So the same thing I just said to Ruben, but for
you know, we one of the things that Commissioner Tobias and I sort of piloted for her, and you can jump in, was doing sort of an interview with her that was written down, that then we rather than sort of trying to get her squeezed into media interviews, and I can forward it to you all so you can take a look at what it looked like. And I sent it out to like 30 of the smallest little padong sort of newspapers, and we got pretty decent coverage. And I would say a lot of them followed up and watched the commission hearing and did small little reports on it. So we'll forward that to you as an example. Are you comfortable with that, Commissioner Tobias? Yeah, so I'm happy to forward that to you as an example of one way that we're sort of piloting some outreach to see how it works and varying it. And Commissioner Prentice and I will talk about it tomorrow for her.
All right, guys. So we'll go ahead and see Project Management Committee. Anything Commissioner Tobias or Commissioner McClellan have?
No, I think we're all moving in the right direction, and the criteria, the rollout for the communities of interest, you know, how we're going to partner with those. And then the other thing is, as we know, is some sort of discussion eventually what the delay in the census will actually do, how it will impact us.
Yeah. All right, that's a good segue into the communities of interest. Any updates from communities of interest, Commissioner Prentice?
No, not since the last time we met. I can say, though, that maybe tied a little bit to the previous discussion about prepping for the next hearing. I have been doing a bit of outreach with the Fair Maps Coalition folks and the League of Women Voters within my district, and talking both about the 6 CD hearing, but also the communities of interest. I just heard today, actually, from one of those folks that they did a whole a whole group of them did the train the trainer session for the districtor, and they're super excited to start using it. So they're very eager to get us to talk to us and start doing that. So I don't know, Anne Marie or Susan, if you had anything else you wanted to add.
No, I just emailed you and Susan about maybe having a time to talk with the Fair Maps Coalition about how they can partner with us. They're anxious
That
to
would be great.
get input from us.
And on that point, the outreach committee has talked about how to partner with that coalition as well. Knowing that we can't have a social media presence as a commission, what are some ways that we can just sort of, pass the buck to them? So it sounds like we're on the same page there. So let us know how we can help, if at all, and if that's what you're thinking when you say that.
Definitely, thank you.
All right. And lessons learned, Commissioner Anthony, you have any updates?
No, actually, most of the best practices, I think, have been played out in the document that we brought forward, and so, I don't have anything else to add.
Awesome. All right, guys. Well, I think that's all that we got here. Thank you guys for coming out tonight. And I think we got a lot of good stuff done here tonight that we can move forward with. Look forward to hearing from all the committees and hearing from all you guys. And the 6th is coming up, so we didn't forget about you, Melissa. So 6th CD hearing is coming up, and I'll see all you guys there. Any closing adjustments, comments, anything?
Do we have another meeting scheduled? We just did one of those schedule monkey things. Is there any outcome to that?
Yeah, Maddie.
Yeah, I have to send around the actual calendar invites, but I believe we still have one more working meeting on the books currently, the last week of February. And then I'll send around the March hearings, or excuse me, meetings.
When is it in the last week in February?
Give me 1 second. Oh, I suppose it's not, because we just have one more week in February and we have the hearing.
I think March is our.
Yep. So we don't have any other working meetings on the book, but we will have them once I send them around for that first week of March. So we'll maintain the every other week cadence, except we'll be done shortly with the hearings and then move to just meetings.
Okay, thank you.
All right, guys. Well, thank you all, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a good night,
everybody.
Have a good night.
Stay warm.